Recording in progress.
All right, it is 7 p.m., April 20, 4/20. Welcome, everyone. We're coming off a great weekend of storytelling. I wonder how many of us were at the Bay Area Storytelling Festival. And of course, if you were, there Shags was, I see. You were treated to some of the greatest tellers in the country, Sheila Arnold, Ethnotech, Diane Ferlat, Corey Rosen, and the great Willie Claflin. It was a wonderful weekend. And so it's nice to be together with storytellers again this fine night. Tonight is the April edition of Genre Tales, and that means historical stories. I am Brandon Spars. I am your host, and I am really excited because I am a history teacher, a high school history teacher. So I'm hoping I can get some material for tomorrow's lectures. And I'd like to introduce Andrew Loeffner, who is on tech this evening. Andrew Loeffer waving his hand right now. And he does tonight's tech as well as every Genre Tales tech, I believe. So thank you for that, Andrew. I really appreciate your help. Genre Tales is every third Wednesday. And of course, maybe some of you are familiar with some of the other genres that are represented: tall tales, personal stories, humorous stories, and of course tonight, historical stories. To be a storyteller, you must be nominated by one of the local SWAPs. And tonight, we have Ben Tucker, who is a SAC board member, who was nominated by the board, nominated by me, as a matter of fact. We have OJ Mosen from Storytellers of San Diego. We have Lee Amatangelo from Story Masters, Los Angeles. We have Linda Kennedy, Sacramento Storytellers Guild, Larry Kluger from the Contra Costa Tale Spinners, and Eric Hurt, Foothill Storytelling Guild, and Genevieve Franklin from the Do Tell Story Swap in Santa Rosa. And once again, they were nominated by their guilds to represent the guilds. So at the end, there will be information about our upcoming Genre Tales dates and the nomination deadlines. I want to remind everyone that this event is being recorded. These stories are also copyrighted on this date, April 20, 2022, by the storytellers who presented them. Do not retell them or adaptations of them without the permission of the teller who presented them. That's always good practice wherever you go. Well, without any further ado, I am going to introduce our first storyteller, Linda Kennedy, from the Sacramento Storytellers Guild. Linda has been telling stories for over 30 years at many venues, including civic organizations, community radio, schools, and several SWAP groups. She is a member of the Foothills Storytelling Guild, Sacramento Storytellers Guild, NSN, and of course, SAC. She's been invited to be a regional teller at the Sierra Storytelling Festival. And from 2009 all the way to 2019, Linda was invited to be the MC of the open telling concert at the Sierra Storytelling Festival. For the past 10 years, she has been a volunteer storyteller at the Women's Empowerment Program for Sacramento, where story was used to help previously homeless women on their story and be in charge of their next chapter. Everyone, welcome Linda Kennedy to our Genre Tales stage. Take it away, Linda.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, after being a TA for 7 years, I decided I wanted a classroom of my own, but I needed to go back to school and work on unfinished work yet and to get a credential. So it was January 1985. I went back to school at the age of 44, full-time student. Now, The first semester, I signed up for a sociology class that I found out I didn't need. I had taken something similar before, and I went to check out. Back in those days, you didn't have the computer to do the delete and add. You had to take a withdrawal card and find the professor. And he wasn't in his office. I ran to the lecture hall. He had already begun his class. So I sat down to wait till the end of class. I got out my notebook. I listened, probably did some doodling. And then he said something that got my attention. And I said, I better write that down. He put it on the board, so I got it perfectly written down. After class, he signed me out and I went on home. On the way home, I passed the Methodist church that I attended. I looked in the parking lot and it was full of cars of my friends there from the women's group. And I thought, I'm missing something. So I pulled in and there they were all standing around a table with a strip of cotton that was 16 inches high, 36 inches long. And a woman there was telling them about this project that was coast to coast being done by women. It was led by a woman from Denver. Her name was Justine Merritt. And she wanted to do something that would teach or show world leaders that there was alternatives on how to run their nations without the threat of nuclear war. And she'd remembered in 1979 how our country had united in support of the hostages in Iran by tying yellow ribbons around fence posts and flagpoles. And she said, well, that's what we need to do. We need to tie a ribbon around the Pentagon. And so her committee came up with a plan that women's groups from coast to coast would take a strip of cotton, 16 inches high, 36 inches long, and they would create a little banner about peace. And they'd all be sewn together and be big enough to go around the Pentagon. So there they were, the women there in that room, and they were looking at that piece of cotton, and they said, well, the theme for that banner or the ribbon project was, what would you miss most if it was lost forever due to nuclear war? And they had decided that their banner would show a field of wildflowers, but they did not know what to write on it. So I said, wait, and I got out my notebook. And I showed them the quote I had just written down while waiting to drop a class. And that quote was, there will be peace when the power of love is greater than the love of power. They loved it. And that is what happened. That was done on the piece of cotton in calligraphy. They painted a field of wildflowers on the cotton, signed it at the bottom, and it was sent off to where it was sewn end to end with other pieces of fabric from all over the United States. Now, they wanted a piece long enough, a ribbon, long enough to go around the Pentagon. They received 24,000 36-inch strips. It equaled 15 miles. It was enough to go around the Pentagon. It was enough to go around the Capitol building. It was enough to go around the White House. And it was going to be displayed on August 4th, later that year, 1985, the weekend of the 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And there was a portion that was saved, that was sent to Hiroshima and put around the Peace Memorial Dome that weekend. Some of the women from our group went to Washington. They found our piece. I can only imagine that it had been categorized somehow so you could find it by state, and they took a picture of it. And they came back and they told us about that day. There were thousands and thousands of women. Some had brought their families, the children, and the women stood side by side all around these buildings, holding this ribbon like this in peaceful and quiet observation. The crowd, they said, was happy to be there because they were all united doing this purpose. But they said it was reverent, it was sacred, it was meditative, is a word that I heard. There was a program at the National Cathedral, and Pete Seeger was there singing peace songs. And I can only imagine that one of them had the expressed meaning of our little strip, where have all the flowers gone? Now, that could be the end of the story, but it's not. I finished. I got my credential. I was teaching fourth grade right there in Gilroy, and I was happy as I could be to have my own classroom finally. Now, one evening I was reading the local newspaper, and I turned to my favorite column, Backstages, written by my friend Chuck, who promoted and supported the performing arts in our community. But that night he didn't write about that. He wrote about his boss, the city planner, Mike Dorn, who had gone to Kiev, Ukraine. And there he was at a conference, and he stayed with a host family. And when they found out he was from Gilroy, they got so excited. He said, yes, everybody knows about the Garlic Festival. And they said, no, we're members of the Youth Peace Committee. And they took him to a school, maybe like the one where I taught. They took him into a classroom, maybe like mine, with chalkboards, desk chairs. Maybe because mine had an American flag, and because we did fourth grade, we did the history of California in fourth grade. I had the California bear flag. Maybe they had that blue and yellow flag. Mine had crepe paper California poppies hanging from the ceiling. Maybe theirs had sunflowers. I don't know. But they took them over to a wall where there was a 36-inch strip, 16 inches high, of cotton that said, there will be peace when the power of love is greater than the love of power. And across it was painted wildflowers. And at the bottom, it said, the United Methodist Women of Gilroy. I had a little bit of pride flip-flopping around in my heart, knowing that I'd had a little bit to do with that banner piece going from Gilroy to Washington to Kiev. Mary Oliver, in her poem, Instructions for a Living Life, says it best. Pay attention, check. Be astonished, check. Tell about it, check. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Linda, it is very easy to see why you are so much in demand as an MC and a teller. Thank you for that story.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you.
I wish you could take all 50 miles of your fabric and wrap it around the Kremlin too.
Yes, yes, we need to do it again. Yep.
I love how the ending of your story led to another ending too. That was very artfully done.
Thank you.
Bringing it home to us today and now. Thank you very much, Linda.
Thank you.
Wow, our next teller, you're in for a treat. I happen to know because I have brought this teller into my history classroom before. I plan on doing it again as well. Our next teller is Ben Tucker, also known as Brother Ben. He is on the board of the Storytelling Association of California, along with me. We're fellow board members. And of course, Ed Lewis is here tonight as well. Ben Tucker, also known as Brother Ben, is a San Francisco Bay Area storyteller, author, and I didn't know this, Ben, singer. His historical stories feature unsung heroes whose stories are seldom told. Brother Ben is a board member of SAC, Prescott Circus Theater, and Stagebridge. To find out more about Brother Ben, you can visit his website at iambentucker.com. And I'm sure we can drop that in the chat as well. iambentucker.com. Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Brandon. The story I'm going to tell tonight was written by a good friend, Hillary Kaiser. It's a historical novel and also a play. And Hillary and I were classmates and colleagues at Stagebridge. You say you writing a book about them laws that they had in some states that prohibited people from different races marrying, living together, and even having sex? And you want to talk about me and Paulette? Sure, I'll tell you about it. Now, I was born and raised in West Virginia. Now, Paulette and I met when I was stationed in France, just at the end of World War II. We started dating, and she got pregnant. Now, I didn't want to do like those other GIs and leave a souvenir baby. I wanted to do the right thing. But there were problems. And to make matters worse, my company was transferred to Germany. Now, I remember a phone call Paulette and I had back in 1946 when I was stationed in Germany. Hello, Paulette. Say Larson. Yeah, it's me, baby. It's Larson. Now listen, I can't talk long. A lot of guys back here want to use the phone and we only got one. Now, how's little Philippe? Oh, that's good, good, good. You still nursing him? Oh, wonderful. Now, how much does he weigh now? Yeah, I miss you too, baby. Yeah, I do miss you too. No, I don't have no solution right now. No, you can't come here right now. I'm still working on trying to get you over here. Now, baby, don't cry. Please don't cry. You just can't come here yet. What? Hold on, Jack. Sorry, baby. Listen, other guys want to get to the phone. I'll call you back. I promise I will. Moi aussi, je t'aime. Au revoir. It just ain't fair. It just ain't fair. But who am I fooling? It ain't ever been fair for black folks in America anywhere. But you know what? I ain't gonna stand for this. I'm going to go above the army. I'm gonna do something about this. I am going to write a letter to the Supreme Court. That's what I'm going to do. How should I start this letter here? Dear Honorable Sirs, I guess that's what I should call them. Ain't no women on the Supreme Court. No, dear Honorable Sirs, I am a regular Army man with 5 years of service. I landed in Normandy with my battalion, and we helped to liberate France. Should I tell them about my stars? Yeah. After the war ended, they gave me 4 battle stars for bravery. I re-enlisted in the army and asked to remain in Europe. Now, I was stationed in France where I met a French woman at a Red Cross dance. No, let me take that out there. They don't need to know where we met. I met a French woman, Mademoiselle Paulette Dupree. We fell in love, and in July 1946, she gave birth to my child. But since she was a French national, I had to get permission from my commanding officer, Major Dennison. But he refused to grant me his permission. He said West Virginia was a southern state in the South, They don't allow no Negroes to marry white persons. What should I say next? Okay, I got it. Sirs, why am I being denied permission to marry the mother of my child because I am a Negro? I believe the Constitution of the United States states that it is unlawful to discriminate against a man because of race, color, or religion. Sirs, I risked my life fighting against Hitler's army. In the interest of democracy, I beg you to grant me permission to marry my fiancée, Mademoiselle Paulette Dupret, and to become the legal father of my child. Respectfully yours, Private First Class Lawson Day. Well, as they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Well, I tell you what happened. The Supreme Court did not answer me directly. What they did was they forwarded my letter to the Pentagon. And they wrote to my commanding officer, and they told him that he had misinterpreted the circular regarding mixed marriages. Sergeant Dennison wasn't supposed to tell me I couldn't marry a white girl. He was supposed to tell me that since I was from a southern state, that if I married her, I couldn't go back to West Virginia and live with her. And so, after a while, I was able to bring Paulette over to Germany, and we were married by an army chaplain. I re-enlisted and asked to stay in Europe for a year. And after a year, I was eligible for the GI Bill. And Paulette and I moved back to the States. Couldn't move back to West Virginia, but we moved to Indiana where they didn't have them laws. But I loved my old West Virginia home as bad as it was, and I couldn't wait to get back. And so in 1967, when they changed them laws on miscegenation, we went back, or I went back to West Virginia and brought my wife with me. We bought a nice little house on the GI Bill, and we have been married for 47 years. We got 5 kids and 12 grandkids. We got doctors, we got lawyers, and we got educators. Say what? You asked me if I'm bitter? No, I ain't bitter anymore. But at one time I sure was. But you know, sometimes I sit back here in my rocking chair and I think, and I wonder, what would have happened if I had not written that letter to the Supreme Court?
Wow. Thank you, Ben. I like how you use the hats to, kind of create a distance in time there. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
My family's from the Midwest. And when you mentioned Indiana, I thought, oh, he's not going to stay there long. Back to West Virginia.
Had to
Okay.
get back to my old Virginia home, as bad
Yeah.
as it was.
Now that was about, you were in character as a Larson, right?
Yes,
So
Larson.
did
Mhm.
you research this young man's life and
No, it's actually it was a historical novel written by a friend of mine,
oh, right.
Hilary Kaiser, and it's called Warriors and War Brides, a
Mhm.
true story.
Very good. Well, you brought it to life really well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. Wow, that brings us to our third teller of the evening, Alice O.J. Mazen, from Storytellers of San Diego, and I hope I'm saying your name right, Alice Mazen.
You're on mute, Alice.
Alice is a native of Washington, D.C., who loves to tell stories that energize hope, encourage faith, exude love, and enlighten minds. While serving as a Navy chaplain, he discovered the joys of storytelling as part of Adopt a School projects where sailors and Marines volunteered to read stories at local schools. Sounds like a wonderful program. He was particularly drawn to stories about people and events of the African diaspora that frequently aren't covered in traditional history classes. Currently, OJ serves as Director of Oral Training with Dynamic Church Planting International. Please welcome OJ to our virtual stage. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Brandon. And it's Mozon.
Mozon, got it.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Here's a story that I've put together about a man that I just learned about a few years ago. Not a doctor, but his oil portrait hangs on the walls of a building in the sacred hall that he once was not allowed to walk down. Years ago, when going to his lab, he was directed to go out of the front door in which he had entered and go around to the rear door for the color. This is the story of Vivian Thomas, Mr. Vivian Thomas. Now I know what you're thinking. That's the girl's name. Well, that's the same thing that Dr. Blaylock said when he first met him. And I get that because my mother's name is Vivian, and I think that name sounds like her name. But Mr. Vivian Thomas, mother had wanted a girl so badly, she had selected that name before he was born in 1910 down in Louisiana. Now, growing up, he moved from Louisiana up to Nashville, Tennessee. And that's where he finished high school. And at the age of 19, he was a master carpenter because he had spent many years working alongside his father and his brother in his carpentry business. Now, what he wanted to do was use his carpentry money to save and to go and pay for college and med school, because what he wanted most was to be a doctor. Well, unfortunately, the Great Depression hit, and all those years of saving, the money was gone, and many of the carpentry jobs were gone. But he was blessed, and he got picked up for the job with one of the historically Black universities, Fisk University, as a handyman. And after working there for a little while, he got a chance to be recommended to go be a lab assistant over at Vanderbilt University for the brilliant but very temperamental Dr. Blaylock. Well, he goes there for this interview. This young Black carpenter sitting on a lab stool face to face with this brilliant young surgeon. And they begin talking and asking questions and listening, and they realized that they indeed were kindred spirits. He got the job, although he heard it was just a job about cleaning up poop and mess from dogs being used for surgical experiments. He loved being in this laboratory with these surgical equipment and books on medical and chemistry and physics and anatomy. And those two, for many years, became a great team. He was primarily working on shock trauma, which helped our troops quite a bit during the war. What Dr. Blaylock realized, because of the skill and the dexterity and the demeanor of Vivian Thomas, that this man had great potential. And just very shortly, he had him performing all those operations he was doing, because what he wanted most was somebody who could do anything he could do and maybe things he could not do. And that's what Vivian Thomas was. They worked together, they solved a lot of problems, and Dr. Blaylock's fame and notoriety really began to expand. He became well known and became aware that he was only able to accomplish what he had accomplished because of the input and insight of Vivian Thomas. After a few years, around 1940, his alma mater, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, invited Dr. Blaylock to come and be the chief surgical officer there. And he worked out a deal that he would only come if they also had a position for Mr. Vivian Thomas. So Vivian and his family, his wife and his two daughters, they all moved to Baltimore as well. Boy, were the folks at Johns Hopkins surprised to find that this man had brought his colored lab assistant to work with him and work with him there in Baltimore. But that's what happened. That's what continued to happen. Now, one thing they met was another doctor named Helen Tossing, and she had a particular interest in a medical condition called the blue baby. This was a birth defect of the heart that caused the blood to not be pumped from the heart into the lungs properly. And those babies would turn blue because lack of oxygen instead of the pink color that they should have been. Dr. Blaylock and Vivian decided to find a solution. So while Dr. Blaylock spent many of his hours teaching medical students and having a very intensive operating schedule, Vivian was in the lab, operating over 200 times on different dogs, trying to find the best procedure to help out. How do you change the pipes of the heart and lung to improve that situation for those little blue babies? He finally did it. And, you know, and he was so glad to be able to accomplish that. And he really was very glad to be in his lab coat, because he knew he was somebody important who made significant contributions. So what he did, he taught Dr. Blaylock how he had conducted those operations. And then with Dr. Blaylock as his assistant, he taught Dr. Blaylock how to do the operation to change the pipes, to get that blood to flow from the heart to the lungs, to help those blue babies. About this time, there was a little girl named Alex Saxon, who was the daughter of a Navy sailor stationed down in Norfolk. And Dr. Blaylock convinced him to allow them to do that operation on his daughter, because she was surely going to die without it. So the historic operation was set up, because this was a time when the medical knowledge was saying you can't operate on a heart. But Vivian had found a way. And now Dr. Blaylock knew what to do. So he got his medical team together, and they had the operation all set up. And of course, you know, all the other doctors were there in the gallery watching. At the last moment, Dr. Blaylock said, "Get me a stool and put it behind me." And Vivian Thomas is going to stand on that stool, look over my right shoulder, and direct and coach me in this operation. And that's exactly what happened. And the operation was a success. And the people breathed a sigh of relief and amazement as they watched that poor little blue baby slowly see his flesh turn soft pink again. And for over 1,000 operations on blue babies, that's how it was done. Dr. Blaylock operating, and Thomas Vivian on the step stool behind him, coached him through the operation because he had no college, he had no medical school training, but he was gifted of God for what he was doing. The unfortunate thing is that as Dr. Blaylock's fame continued to expand, and they took pictures and articles and writings about this fabulous doctor, he failed to acknowledge the significant input of Thomas Vivian. That was a heartbreaker, but Thomas continued to stay there, to train, and to equip a whole new generation of lab assistants and surgical doctors. Eventually, finally, Dr. Blaylock did advocate and got the salary of Vivian Thomas doubled and got him officially positioned not as a janitor anymore, but as the director of the surgical labs. Finally, after training many doctors and surgeons, a group of the surgeons who had been trained by Thomas Vivian decided to surprise him and in 1971 presented an oil portrait of him to hang there at Johns Hopkins. And finally, in 1976, Johns Hopkins awarded him an honorary doctorate and officially put him on the faculty of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And today, Thomas Vivian's portrait hangs on the wall of Blaylock Hall across from the portrait of Dr. Blaylock himself. And that's the story of Thomas Vivian. No college, no medical school, but responsible for starting cardiac surgery. God bless you real good.
Wow. OJ, thank you so much for that story. Now, how did you come across this historical figure?
You know, I found it on the net. I don't know what I was looking for at the time. It was probably doing Black History Month. I was just looking for something interesting.
Yeah,
And I saw the story and I said, oh, this is amazing.
it really
This
was.
this is amazing. But he's written an autobiography. The Washingtonian magazine did a great article on him back several years in the 80s.
Yeah.
And there's also a movie called Made by the Lord's Hands
Wow.
about that. And you can find that movie on YouTube for free. You can also buy it or rent it, but I found it for free and had a chance to watch. And that's how I put the story together with some of those articles in the book and the movie.
I always knew there was a crossover between carpentry and surgery.
Gifted hands.
I can't do either one of them, but I wonder if it means that, oh, my co-host is talking now.
Your co-host is mentioning that there's a crossover between cleaning up dog poop and success.
That's what it is. Absolutely. So I wonder if it means surgery is less delicate or maybe carpentry is more delicate than we thought.
I don't know, but they both take skilled hands.
I knew Dr. Blaylock with a name like that. How could he not be the villain of the story? OJ, thank you so much for a wonderful story.
Thank you, Brandon.
And maybe you can drop some of those titles in the chat if people are interested in researching more about Vivian Thompson. What
I would do that.
amazing historical figure. Well, our next teller, Lee Amatangelo. I practiced saying that name a few times. I hope I have it right. He delivered his first learned paper at the age of 12 to the New York Mineralogical Society. At age 19, he went to Harvard and graduated in just 3 years, summa cum laude, with a degree in chemistry. At the urging of his professors, he went to Europe to further his studies and took a PhD in chemistry from the University of Göttingen in Germany. He speaks 7 languages. When Einstein retired, he took over as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and today he will deliver a presentation titled "The Day the Sun Rose Twice," being portrayed by SAC member Lee Amatangelo, who is representing the Story Masters based in Los Angeles. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer.
On July 16, 1945, a young girl, Georgina Ingram, blind since birth, found herself traveling down a dark, deserted New Mexican desert highway in the wee hour before dawn. Her older sister Elizabeth was driving her to Albuquerque for school when at exactly 5:29 a.m. local time, the sun rose in the west with the brilliance of 1,000 suns, and soon after went straight down. So bright that Georgina saw something and turned to her sister and said, "What was that?" Her sister Elizabeth had no answer. 40 minutes later, the sun rose again, this time in the east, and it would stay up all day, as it normally would, under the hand of God. The sun that rose first that day was under the hand of man, for it was the first time in the history of the human experience that a nuclear device was detonated. So ushered in the nuclear age. The device was a plutonium implosion mechanism whose engineering had been worked out at the secretive lab Los Alamos, high on a mesa in the desert of New Mexico, under the auspices of the Manhattan Project. Just 12 hours before the test, I was informed by George Kistiakowsky, the mathematician we brought in from Harvard to work on the implosion lens, that the device would not work. I blew up, gave him what others called the blue glare treatment. I stared daggers at him with my piercing blue eyes. "You have failed me. You have failed this project. $2 million by the US government. You have failed everyone who has worked on this project." "Okay, Dr. Oppenheimer, I'll bet you $5 of your money against a month of my salary that I will get this device to work before the test." "I'll take that bet." There was another bet going on, how big the blast would be in terms of TNT equivalents. Nobel laureate Hans Bethe said about 5 to 7 kilotons. Stanley Ulam also said 5 to 7 kilotons. The bombastic Edward Teller said 45 kilotons. The selection spanned a wide range. I thought it would be a little blip in the desert. I picked a mere 3 kilotons. Nobel laureate Isidore Rabi was spot on with 20 kilotons. But there was a more macabre betting pool that was taking place that started back at UC Berkeley by Edward Teller. What if, once the chain reaction starts, it ignites the atmosphere? Some said, "Oh no, just 35 square miles." Others said all of New Mexico, while others thought this was the end of the world. The location of the test site was in Alamogordo, New Mexico, at a place the indigenous people called Jorando del Muerto, the journey of death. It was 210 miles south of Los Alamos. Should anything go wrong, all those scientists and Nobel laureates would live. I happened to be reading the Holy Sonnet number 14 by my favorite wondrous metaphysical poet, John Donne, at the time we were trying to name the site. And it starts off, "Batter my heart, 3-person God." So I named the site Trinity. Well, when news came that the implosion lens was working, the countdown began, the first countdown in history that had global importance. I went out to the test site to be alone with my thoughts and to smoke my pipe, as I often would do. The gadget, as we called it, was hanging from a tower 100 feet high. It looked like a VW bus, a VW bug that you guys would remember from the 1960s. It had wires protruding from every direction. The weather that night was horrible. There were storms off in the distance with lightning strikes. Some worried that as the storm approached us, lightning would hit the gadget and it would detonate it. Leslie Groves, the general who was in charge of the Manhattan Project from the Armed Services side, came out to the tower just about the same time, as well as a few others. He caught sight of Jack Hubbard, our resident meteorologist, and in his typical gruff voice, "How's the weather going to be tomorrow?" "Well, looks like we're probably going to have rain." "If there's rain, there's going to be hell to pay," as he stormed off. Everybody hated Groves. He was universally loathed. Some say he had an ego greater than that of Napoleon Bonaparte himself. One of the gentlest of scientists at Los Alamos, Ken Bainbridge, once said, "He's the greatest son of a bitch ever, but the greatest." It finally comes time for the event, but let me give you a sense of General Leslie Groves. He had just finished building the Pentagon on time and under budget. There are no elevators in the Pentagon. Why? Because Groves didn't want to have any fat generals in the armed services. The irony there, of course, is he himself was a very big man. Standing side by side with me, we made an interesting pair at my 120 pounds at 5'10". The test finally comes. And as you can imagine, nerves are on edge. We don't have a radio station because we can't apply for a FCC license. So we begin to play Tchaikovsky's Serenade to Strings on these loudspeakers out over the desert landscape. Sam Allison is on the microphone. He starts counting it down under the minute. He gets to 3, and he begins to think, what if the blast is like a lightning strike and it follows the cord of the microphone? So he throws it to the ground and yells, 2, 1, and the gadget detonates. No one is prepared for what we are to see. Bedazzled by the blinding brilliance of the blast, some turn to the Genesis account where God said, "Let there be light." That's what we were seeing that day. When the atomic wind hit me, I went deep into my literary training and went to the sacred Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu is trying to tell the prince to do his duty. And I uncontrollably blurted out, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." As the mushroom cloud grew to 38,000 feet, it turns purple, orange, green. There are lightning strikes inside the cloud itself. It was way more enormous and ominous than we ever could have imagined. It is seen by 3 states. Some think this is the apocalypse itself. The odious Edward Teller is at his observation site wearing sunglasses and applying suntan lotion. Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi, the pure scientist that he was, reaches into his pocket and pulls out some paper and begins to rip it up into small little pieces. And when the atomic wind hits him, he takes those pieces and lets them go. He goes down on the ground and measures the displacement. He takes a slide rule out of his pocket and he begins to calculate the amount of detonation, and he's spot on with 20 kilotons. Some say that slide rule belongs in the Smithsonian. At my observation point, George Kitsiakowski is blown off his feet. He catches sight of me and he comes with his hand raised to shake it and says, "Hey, you owe me $5. I shake his hand and I take my billfold out. "I don't have it. I'll have to pay you later," which I do. And some say that $5 belongs in the Smithsonian too. Well, let me leave you with this. The device we tested that day was not just a bigger bomb. It was clear something new has come into the world. We were not just burning a lump of coal. We were going into the inner workings of the building blocks of the cosmos and releasing an immense potential. We were like little Promethean beings who found the hiding place of fire. We let a genie out, and we can never put that genie back into the bottle. The history of humanity will forever be changed. We will always look at history as the time before we had nuclear weapons and the time after. And that demarcation day, July 16, 1945, is that pivotal point. On that day, for those who witnessed the event, some laughed, some cried, most were silent. On that day, for a brief moment, a young blind girl saw for the first and last time in her life. On that day, for the first time in the history of the human experience, a nuclear device was detonated. On that day, the sun rose twice.
Wow.
Brandon.
Yeah. That was a very poetic ending, Lee. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, Fermi and Teller and Oppenheimer were all there.
Oh, Richard Feynman was there, Hans Bethe, Isidore Rabi. These are all Nobel laureates. Some got their
Wow.
Nobels after. It was, when they wrote their memoirs, many of them said it was the best time of their life. It was like an intellectual commune. At
Did
one
they
point,
suffer from the nuclear wind that they were exposed to?
no one was reported as dying from that. They were at a 10,000 yard observations point. But when they got off the bus from coming back from Alamogordo, Enrico Fermi's wife, Laura, says they looked like these men had aged 15 years. They were gray, they were haggard.
Wow. So powerful. And the line from the Gita, wow. I find it fascinating that they were betting on whether it would work and then how powerful it would be. And of course, the real gamble is what they had wrought. And we still have that gamble. Thank you so much, Lee, for a fantastic story. And you really brought it to life. Well, our next teller is I share a swap with. She's from the Santa Rosa Do Tell story swap. Genevieve Navarre Franklin discovered the joy of personal storytelling on her first visit to the Moth at the Freight and Salvage in Berkeley on July, I don't know what the date was. It was in July 2017, where she was astounded to hear her name pulled from the hat first. Oh my goodness. That is a heart stopper, and that's a very large audience too. Since then, she's told stories at live and virtual storytelling events, such as the Moth, regional story swaps, and Toastmasters, as well as corporate conferences. Captivated throughout her life by the effect of words on the human spirit, she draws on her experience as an immigrant, a cancer survivor, a mediator, a judicial interpreter, and chaplain, and the unforgettable years she shared with her sight-impaired, chronically ill, yet magnificently loving partner, Dawn. She seldom won anything but hearts. She could want nothing else. And here she is to tell her story, A Soul Rises, Genevieve Franklin.
Thank you so very much. I'm gazing over the Evergreen Cemetery amid 50,000 people, all held together in breathless silence. Abraham Lincoln, rising from the chair his tall body had been folded into, has just spoken. On this 19th of November, 1863, in just 2 minutes of consecration, the president has fully captured the essence of the 3 fateful days in July that have been come to be known as the Battle of Gettysburg. My name is Ginny Wade. People around here don't spell very well. If I ever go down in history, it's probably going to be as Jenny Wade. My beloved sister Georgiana is somewhere here as well. Some people joke that we're secessionist sympathizers, what with supposedly being named after two southern states, Virginia and Georgia. But nothing could be further from the truth. Our family lives a ways from here, north, on Breckenridge Street, where Mama, Georgia, and I have supported ourselves and our three younger brothers as seamstresses ever since Father, so debilitated and broken, was committed to an asylum. When Georgia married John Lewis McClellan, they moved into a two-story duplex in a red brick house on Baltimore Street, no more than a stone's throw from here at the base of Cemetery Hill. Out of nostalgia, she took the quilt she had made when she was just a little girl of 5 with her. Her husband, John, mustered out with the Pennsylvania Infantry just this last November, not knowing that she was carrying his child. He's out there still. Mama moved so she could be close to Georgia around the time sweet baby Louis was born on June 26th. Thinking it would be safe, we decided I would stay at our home with my youngest brother and Isaac, the 6-year-old we cared for as that dear little child couldn't walk. But the winds of war were gathering, so I carried little Isaac all the way to Georgia's house, then returned for my brother, locked the door behind me, put the key in my pocket, and walked back. By Wednesday, July 1st, a fierce battle was raging in the north, but then it shifted southward. It was terrifying. Instead of being safer at Georgia's, we were caught between Confederate sharpshooters in the front of us and Union soldiers retreating and counterattacking behind us. Soon the walls of our house were pockmarked with dozens and dozens of bullet holes. We could neither leave through the front nor access our outside cellar doors. But the plight of the weary Union soldiers tore unremittingly at my heart, and a side door allowed me to dash to the water pump and fill pitcherful after pitcherful of water to slake the soldiers' thirst. Soon, while Georgia and Mama cared for the children, I was able to set about baking what bread I could for the famished boys. On the next day, July 2nd, the house was rocked violently by a 10-pound shrapnel shell fired from Oak Ridge, intended for the Union's position behind us. Instead, it went through the roof and traveled diagonally through the attic. It punched a hole through the thick concrete wall that separated the two units and lodged in the opposite overhang. It's still there, undetonated. God help us. I'm chagrined to say, I fainted from the fright. But still, before retiring that night, Mama and I set out sponge ferment to rise overnight, to bake bread again in the morning. I was well awake by 4 a.m. on the 3rd. I kneaded the dough, left it to rise, and began my morning devotions. The Lord is my rock and my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? But when I got to, when evil men advance against me to devour my flesh, Georgia fell apart, begging that I stop. And of course I did, saying to Mama, if there is anyone to be killed in this house today, I hope it is me, as Georgia has that little baby. Maybe I should have kept on praying after all. At 7 a.m., a barrage of Confederate bullets broke every pane of glass in the parlor window beneath which I had been resting. Then a bullet hit Georgia's bedpost, ricocheted against the mantel, and landed where she the baby and Mama were lying in a pile of shards. We were trapped and we were trembling. But there was still bread to be made. At 8 o'clock, I ventured into the kitchen to shape the dough into loaves, then asked Mama, please ready the stove fire. As soon as I spoke those words, a bullet bore through the front door, then improbably drilled through the kitchen door as well. And undeterred by those obstacles, it struck me in the back, below my shoulder blade. I fell. On hearing the sound, Mama turned to look, and with an eerie calm, went into the parlor and said, Georgia, your sister is dead. The mini ball had come through my heart. And thus I became the only civilian casualty of the Battle of Gettysburg. Georgia let out a scream fit to wake up all the spirits in the land, but I was not to return. In some way, I could sense their panic, and I wanted them to know. My heart trusted in him, and I am helped. But they could not. Their cries brought a small group of Union soldiers who, knowing the family was in such dire danger, braved their own death by coming into the house to move them to safety. There was no way other than through the attic. So the forlorn group crawled across it through the very opening in the concrete wall that had been made the day before by the shrapnel shell, and back down and into the cellar of the south-facing duplex, where its residents, a woman and her 4 little children, were already sheltering and shivering with fear. Those young boys then took Georgia's cherished quilt, wrapped my body in it, and carried me with such respect up those same steps, through that same gap, down those same doors, into the dark, dank cellar. I can't imagine what it was like for the little band huddled closely in the shadows that night. I could hear them in hushed tones for the sake of the children, reading the same psalms that I had said that morning. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The fires of battle were at least extinguished on the following day, the 4th of July. It was Georgia's birthday, but neither that event, nor the founding of our nation, nor the Union's hard-won victory were observed with hurrahs by those there. At 5 p.m., the soldiers placed my body in an abandoned casket, my dress flecked with flour, and my hands still encrusted with dough, and quietly lowered it into a reverently dug grave. Thus was I buried in the yard at Georgia's house, and there my body remains today. Perhaps someday I too will rest in this now ravaged cemetery when it returns to its once peaceful glory, to lie by those who valiantly fought so that this nation shall not perish from the earth. If that time comes, I hope that Jack, my dear betrothed, will be buried near me. He died on a faraway field of battle 9 days after I did, never knowing that I had preceded him to the holy grounds. We were to be married in September. Besides the key to the Breckenridge house, when I was struck down, his photograph was as ever in my pocket. That evening, Mama took the dough that had been waiting in the kitchen and baked 15 loaves of bread for the brave and bedraggled boys in blue. I wonder if President Lincoln will ever know that we too fought the battle, not with bullets, but with bread. Dedicated to all who, even now, fully give their last measure of devotion for the cause of freedom, and to the hands that feed them. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. What a relevant story. OJ put in the chat that he felt like he was in the middle of a battle during your telling. And there was something so powerful about the story being narrated by a corpse, particularly powerful. Thank you for that. Forget how much different the weapons were in the American Civil War than they were in the Revolutionary War, that houses were being completely splintered apart, just like the human lives of those who were suffering through that war.
Well, the invention of the mini ball, which is a French invention, made all the difference because she was hit by a mini ball which would go straight through.
Yeah.
The other balls used to kind of wiggle and kind of lose their momentum.
And it went through two doors.
It went through
before
two
hitting
doors in
her.
a straight line
Yeah,
and lodged in her heart. And she was wearing a corset,
yeah,
so it stayed within her body.
amazing. And thank you for bringing it home to the Ukrainian struggle that is happening now, and the struggle to feed people as well. Genevieve, that was really beautiful.
Thank you. It's been waiting to be told.
Yeah.
And you, Brandon, the story that I told at the last story swap is the companion story to this one.
I could tell. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. So our next teller, Larry Kluger from Contra Costa Tail Spinners. Larry has performed for over 30 years as Lariat Larry, cowboy storyteller, and rope spinner. I like that. Presenting fancy rope spinning and telling tales of the Old West. He tells primarily true tales with expired copyrights or stories for which he has gotten permission. He performed as a juggler and a unicyclist from about 1980 to 2010. When he wasn't a full-time performer, he taught math in San Francisco East Bay middle and high schools. Larry has presented 2,000 to 3,000 performances as a cowboy and a juggler. He has taught over 100,000 people to juggle. Along with the many varied places he has performed, both big and small, he has also been a consultant to Pixar on rope spinning. I wonder if that was for Toy Story with the that cowboy character. Please welcome to the virtual Genre Tales stage, Larry Kluger.
Although it happened 9 years ago on a spring day, a June spring day in 1878, I remember it like it was yesterday. My husband, Henry, woke me up mighty early that morning, gave me a hug and kiss and said, Charlotte, I'll be off in town on business much of the day. That was fine with me. I had plenty of chores to keep me busy. It was about 10 o'clock that morning when those three men rode up to our pioneer cabin. I had just stopped to admire how beautiful this spring day was. The sky was sparkling blue. The river was full and churning with water. And the woods were such an unusually deep shade of green. That's when I noticed those three men approaching on horseback. Although our cabin was in a very remote location on the Kansas-Nebraska border, it was not unusual to see groups of men riding about. There were cowboys looking for stray cattle, men scouting for promising pieces of land, and hunting parties. These three men were different though. I remember thinking, there's something strange about these men. Recognizing that was an accomplishment for me. You see, I wasn't raised on the frontier. I was raised until my mid-teenage years in a thoroughly modern and civilized Midwest town with all the comforts and conveniences of a thoroughly modern and civilized town. When Papa said we'd be moving to a frontier town in Nebraska so he could open a store there, I was very excited. He said it was a great business opportunity, but to me, it sounded like an adventure. I didn't realize how uncivilized and isolated it would be, and dirty. A year and a half later, when I married Henry, I was just starting to get used to that frontier town. But Henry's cabin was even much more isolated. When Henry first took me out to his secluded cabin in the woods, I didn't think I could ever get used to it. How could I ever become a frontier woman? Well, in the year and a half that we had been married, I came to admire the beauty and the solitude of the place. I learned to manage without the conveniences of town. I became familiar with the customs of the frontier, and I learned to fire a rifle and pistol. I even practiced when Henry wasn't around. I thought I was a pretty good shot. I also learned to identify the different types of people traveling through the area. The men who rode up this day, they said they were cowboys looking for stray cattle. They didn't look like any cowboys I had ever seen. They weren't wearing the right clothing. And their horses, they were nice horses, but they weren't cow horses. And they were all too heavily armed, each carrying a rifle and 2 pistols. All those guns would get in the way of a working cowboy. Another thing was strange. They seemed to know that Henry would be gone till late afternoon. I decided these were bad men. They were definitely up to no good. And I started to feel scared. But I told myself, I can't let these men know how I feel. I had learned that on the frontier, hospitality was the rule. So when they asked me, "Can we trouble you for breakfast, ma'am?" I invited them in, hiding my fear. I made them a good breakfast and they sat down to eat. But it was plain to see they weren't really hungry. They just pretended to eat. When they got up, 2 of the men grabbed me, rushed me out the door, and lifted me up to the 3rd man, who was already mounted on his horse. I had been expecting them to do something and was actually glad they were going to take me away. Our nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. This would at least give me a chance to be rescued. No one would be around our cabin for hours, but in riding off, we might run into one of those wandering groups of men. So when they grabbed me, I didn't struggle or scream. The men rode off at a gallop, up the river and along the edge of the woods. As they rode, I thought about my options. We might run into one of those wandering groups of men. That wasn't very likely. Henry would be home in several hours. He would see the dirty dishes left on the table and the chair that had been knocked over when they rushed me out the door. I would never leave the cabin untidy. He would know something was wrong. He would find the hoof prints of the horses of these bad men and follow them until he found and rescued me. But that wouldn't be for several hours. I would have to find some way to delay these men from their evil actions. I had to be alert for any opportunity that might come up. After riding for about 3/4 of an hour, I noticed we were approaching a cabin that I recognized. It had been abandoned early in the spring by a settler whose wife had died. The cabin was small and snug, having a heavy wooden door with a bar to secure it, and 2 windows with almost bulletproof inside shutters. The men rode straight up to the cabin and dismounted. I was helped down from the horse before the man who rode with me got down. As my feet touched the ground, my mind and body reacted quickly. I grabbed the pistol from the holster of the man who helped me down, bang, and shot him in the leg. Then I ran for the cabin carrying the smoking weapon in my hand. The half-open door was only 10 feet away, and I was inside and had the door bar in place in just a couple seconds. The man whom I had wounded had scarcely cried out before I was inside. My actions were so sudden and unexpected that none of the men tried to stop me. Fortunately, the bar for the door was leaning against the wall right behind the door. And as I slid it into place, I thought, now I am safe. 1 man is disabled, and I have 5 bullets left for the other 2. I knew my 3 years of frontier experience had given me the courage and confidence to act quickly and decisively. The wounded man had been shot in the left knee and made a serious fuss about it. I could hear him cursing and groaning in a terrible way. I heard him vow, "That woman should be burned alive at the stake to pay for my injury." His companions at first made fun of him and praised my courage and spunk. But when they realized how serious his injury was, that he would probably lose his leg, and they had a pack of trouble on their hands, they became extremely angry. They made a rush for the door, expecting to easily grab a hold of me and regain control of the situation. But they found the door locked. They turned to the windows, but they were also locked. It became plain to them that I meant to put up serious resistance, so they pulled back to consider their options. From what I overheard, I was convinced the 2 men wanted to help the wounded man off and leave at once. But he kept repeating, "I won't move an inch till I have my revenge on that woman. This is a lonely neighborhood and no one's going to come around before nightfall. You 2 should batter in that door to get that woman." When they pointed out his injury as proof of my bravery, he fiercely shouted, "Damn that woman. It was an accidental shot. She has my pistol, but she wouldn't use it again, not even to save her life. You 2 should get a log and bust in that door." They found a large log and dragged it over. Then they lifted it and made a rush for the door. I knew exactly what they were planning, and I was ready. I quietly unbolted one of the window shutters and swung it back till I could see them. When they began their rush for the door, I lifted the pistol, aimed at the man nearest me, and pulled the trigger. Bang! He fell down and died at once, having been shot through the heart. The other man ran away, but circled back to the wounded man. Then the cursing and ranting and storming began again, and the wounded man propped himself up and emptied the contents of his rifle and pistol into the door and windows of the cabin. I flattened myself against the floor in a corner of the cabin, just in time. Several bullets fell inside, but I was in a safe place. After he'd emptied his weapons, he called upon his partner. "Get that big rock over there and bash in that door. I'll kill you if you don't." I was looking out the window as he said this and saw that his partner, the unwounded man, was more scared of me than he was of his partner. And he refused to comply, saying, "No, that woman is pretty smart as well as being brave. She'll probably just pick me off when I'm not paying attention to her." He was looking at the cabin as he said this and didn't see that his partner, the wounded man, slipped a bullet into his pistol, pointed it towards him, and fired. The bullet was meant to kill, but it didn't even hit. The unwounded man turned, drew his pistol, and fired 3 shots into his attacker's body, causing his death in a minute or two. He didn't go near the body, but waved his hand, indicating he was done with me. He gathered up the horses, tied the rifles to their saddles, and rode off as fast as he could. When I was sure he was gone, I left the cabin and started walking towards home. After about a mile, I met up with Henry and 3 cowboys who'd come to find and rescue me. I told them what had happened, and the cowboys rode off, pursuing the bad man for many miles, but he finally got away. Henry and I made it home safely. All the way home, he kept looking at me, smiling, shaking his head. Finally, he said, "I didn't really have to worry about you." I didn't reply, but I proudly thought, I've finally become a real frontier woman.
Thank you so much, Larry. Wow, what a heroic frontier woman that was. I don't think I've heard a story like that. How did you find a story narrated by a woman from
Well,
the West?
The source I got it from, it wasn't narrated by her. It was a newspaper interview in a newspaper from 1887. And I have the source at home. It was here in my records. It was either the Laramie Boomerang or the Laramie Sentinel. I think it was the Sentinel.
And so you created that through her perspective.
Yes.
That was wonderful.
True story.
Yeah. I love the line, the men were more scared of the woman than of he was more scared of the frontier woman than he was of his partner. I would be too. She's formidable. It was really amazing. Wonderful. I hope I someday get to see you with your rope as well. I've heard it's really remarkable, Larry. Thank you for bringing the West to life.
You're welcome.
We're down to our final teller, our closer, Eric Hurt from Foothill Storytelling Guild. Hi, Eric.
Hi there.
Eric tells with the Foothill Storytelling Guild over the past couple of years. He has won a few awards for telling tall tales, and he started a podcast called Telling Simple. The stories he retells come from some aspects of California's past. His story tonight is called Fencing Road Hogs. That sounds absolutely fascinating. Please welcome to our virtual stage, Eric Hurt.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So I hope you enjoy. And I must start by saying that this is family friendly because, well, the very worst that she would ever do to anyone like me or like you, well, the very worst was, well, let's just say she'd tie you down, she'd strap you down to your kitchen table, she'd light some lamps, she'd spread them around, all around the table, she'd soak her scrapers, boil her pokers, and her sharp, shiny cutters. She'd make you say, ah, and you'd say, as she cut out your swollen tonsils. As a local country doctor, apart from helping out with sores and bruises and cuts, removing tonsils was part of her, well, probably the most serious thing that she would do as part of her duties as she traveled around the Imperial and Coachella valleys here in California. To some, she was known as the medicine woman, but to most, she was known as the first female doctor to work around those parts. She carried a 6-shooter on her hip because she traveled alone. And she traveled at first by horse and buggy, then by train, and then by automobile. She drove everywhere, up and down the valley, making house calls. Well, one day, she drove out to someone's home and she went inside, and the person laying in bed said, oh, their back hurt and their neck hurt, and oh, they had a cut on their head. To which she said, oh. A few days later, she went out to another home, and she went inside, and the person laying in bed said, oh, their back hurt and their neck hurt, and oh, they had a cut on their face. To which she said, oh. And not too long after that, she drove out to another home, and she went inside, and the person laying in bed said, oh, my back hurts, my neck hurts, and oh, I broke my arm. To which she said, oh my. When she asked why, all three said that, well, they had gone out for a drive one day and they drove off the road. The car, there was a car that drove towards them and it wouldn't move out of the way. Well, not too long after that, one late afternoon, she was driving home down the valley just going along, driving on her side of the road. And forgive me here, the roads at that time, they had been paved over the dirt. And so when you're driving down the road, it looked like a black sheet just spread out as far as the eye could see, with no markings on it, except for maybe some dirt and mud. And she was driving down the road on her side of the road, and way up far ahead, she saw a truck driving towards her. And it was driving mostly in the middle of the road. Well, she continued driving down the valley, driving on her side of the road, and up ahead of her, she saw the truck driving towards her, driving mostly in the middle of the road. And she continued driving down the valley, down on her side of the road, when there in front of her was a truck driving straight at her. And she drove away from the truck, and she drove off the road, and the truck drove by her, driving mostly away in the middle of the road. She was all right. She had a few cuts and bruises, but being a doctor, she took care of herself. And when she gathered her thoughts, she drove home. And for days, she thought about what had happened to her and what had happened to those three she found in bed that were hurt. And one morning, she got up quite early, and she drove out to the place where her car drove off the road. And she stood out in the middle of the road. It was all quiet. There were no cars around. And in one hand, she had a horse-haired paintbrush. And in the other hand, she had a bucket filled with white paint. And she stared out at the black sheet of a road that had no markings on it, looking in the direction that the truck had come towards her. And then she turned around, and she took that bucket of white paint. She dipped her brush in it. She dipped it twice. She leaned over in her straight dress, and she slapped that paintbrush against the ground, pulling it forward, making a white stripe. And then she stood up, took 2 steps back, dipped her brush in the paint twice, leaned over, slapped it down on the ground, pulled it back, making another white stripe. And she did this until her paintbrush was dry and her bucket was empty. And then there before her was this long black sheet of a road with these broken white stripes running down the length of it. Well, in time, cars, automobiles driving down it, when they made it to that stretch of the road, they would stay on their side of the road, at least for that stretch of the road. And soon the town heard about what she had done, and then they painted their roads. And the counties, they heard what the towns had done. They painted their roads until it spread throughout the state, throughout the country, throughout the world. And if you ever wondered how our roads came to be painted, well, supposedly there were 2 guys in Michigan that thought about the same idea about the same time, but I think that's more of a tall tale. Though if you're wondering how our roads came to be painted, well, there was this local country doctor whose name was Dr. June McCarroll. And back in 1916, 1917, she added some stripes to a road, making our lives that much safer. Now, as for Dr. McCarroll, she went on to continue helping with cuts and sores and bruises. But every once in a while, the worst thing she would do to someone was, well, she'd strap them down, she'd tie them down to their kitchen table, she'd soak her scrapers, she'd boil her pokers and their sharp, shiny cutters. She'd make them say, ah, and they'd say, as she cut out their swollen tonsils. And then she'd leave them with a sucker on a stick. And those standing around watching would pray they'd never get sick. At least that's the way I heard it. Thank you.
Eric, that was really delightful. I loved your blend of kind of folksy telling with history there. And I'm with you. I would, yeah, those 2 guys up in Michigan or whatever. Now that's just a tall tale.
Yeah.
That's not history.
No, not at all.
I would love to think it was a country doctor that painted that stripe right down the middle of the road for the first time.
Thank you.
Thank you
a lot of
so
fun
much
telling
for
it.
that.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, we have had an evening of fantastic historical stories. We have had some remarkable hats as well. What is it about historical stories that bring out the hats? And one pipe, that would be Dr. Oppenheimer's pipe, of course. But one of the things that I particularly enjoyed about our stories is this real care about seeking out these wonderful perspectives. Why we've had the perspective of the first Black surgeon, really, brought to life tonight. A young GI who took it upon himself to write the Supreme Court. A prairie woman, a female country doctor, and of course, a young woman trying to survive the battle in Gettysburg and being the one civilian casualty. I think that's the power of storytelling, bringing those perspectives that are not always the ones that make it into our high school history books, right? Oppenheimer certainly did. And I'm glad we had Oppenheimer as well. But I think we had a real treat tonight to get to see all of those different voices and perspectives that aren't always in the textbooks. So I had a really wonderful time tonight, and it was such an honor to have been your MC introducing all of these talented storytellers. I just want to make a couple of announcements. Genre Tales, of course, happens the third Wednesday every month. And the way it works, you are nominated by your story swap. And you heard how each of these fine tellers tonight represented one of the local swaps here in California. Nominations for our next event, which is going to be Legends, Urban and Traditional. Legends, Urban and Traditional. Nominations are due by May 8th, and that, of course, is for Wednesday, May 18. And on the horizon, we have in June, Fantasy and Fairy Tales, July, Humorous Stories, and then come August, the cycle starts over. And I can't remember whether it was personal or folk tales that was first, but it's one of those two. And we go through all of these amazing genres again over the course of a year. I want to thank Ed Lewis, who this is really his brainchild, and he is giving space to all of these different genres. And it's so nice because they really do belong together in a space together. And it's great to see the spectrum that is storytelling, the range. There's always something about any kind of story at its core that is really common to all of them. And I think we all celebrate that, whether it's a folk tale, a personal tale, or a story from history. And thank you for helping me celebrate that tonight. Ed, would you like to make any other announcements here at the end?
No, except thank everyone for an exceptional evening of storytelling. And I learned a lot from tonight, and I had a great time. Thank you so much.
I've got a week of lesson plans when I get the recording here. Thank you all very much. And I just want to thank Andrew Lawfer once again, who made the evening run very smoothly. And it's just so nice how he spotlights people and makes sure that everybody's muted. And there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes here. And Andrew always does a fine job. Thank you so much,
Well,
Andrew.
thank you. Absolutely. Thank you so much. My pleasure.